The ridge was too steep. The angle was wrong. Every spotter who glassed the valley below said the same thing. No clean line of sight, no stable position, no chance. But Sergeant Matthias Auer didn't ask for opinions. He wedged his shoulder against the frozen rock, angled his carabiner 98K downward at a slope that defied every manual he'd ever read, and squeezed the trigger. The first Nazi dropped before the echo reached the trees. 38 more would follow before the sun set on the coldest day of the war. It was December 1944, and the Eastern Front had become a frozen hell where men died as much from cold as from bullets. The Wehrmacht was retreating, but not quickly, not quietly, and not without exacting a price for every meter of snow-covered ground. In the Austrian Alps near the Slovenian border, a German unit had been tasked with holding a narrow mountain pass long enough for supply columns to escape encirclement by advancing Soviet forces. The pass was a natural choke point, flanked on one side by a sheer cliff face and on the other by a frozen river estuary that couldn't bear the weight of armored vehicles. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the road. Whoever controlled the road controlled the retreat. Matthias Auer was 26 years old, a former hunting guide from the Tyrol region who had grown up tracking chamois and red deer across slopes so steep that most men couldn't stand upright on them. He had been conscripted in 1942, trained as a marksman, and deployed to the Eastern Front where his rural skills translated into something far darker. By late 1944, he had 43 confirmed kills, most of them Soviet soldiers, and a reputation among his unit as someone who could shoot from positions that shouldn't exist. He was quiet, methodical, and utterly unshaken by the chaos around him. His commanding officer once said Matthias didn't fight like a soldier. He fought like the mountains themselves, patient, immovable, and merciless. The ridge Matthias had chosen was a jagged outcrop of limestone that jutted from the mountainside at a 70-degree angle. It overlooked the valley road from nearly 300 meters above, but the geometry was all wrong. A sniper needed a flat, stable surface to brace against. He needed a clear line between eyes, scope, and target. He needed to account for gravity, wind, and bullet drop in predictable ways. This ridge offered none of that. The rock face slanted backward, forcing a shooter to lean out over open air just to see the road below. The wind howled upward from the valley in violent gusts that could shove a man off balance. The cold had turned the stone into slick ice in places, and there was no cover, no trench, no sandbag wall to hide behind. Every tactician in the unit had dismissed it as a useless position. Matthias saw it differently. He arrived at dawn alone, carrying his rifle, a wool blanket, 6 boxes of ammunition, a canteen of melted snow, and a small leather pouch filled with dried venison. He moved slowly, testing each foothold, using his free hand to steady himself against the rock. When he reached the outcrop, he didn't try to stand. He lay flat on his stomach, wedged his boots into a crack in the stone, and let his torso hang partially over the edge. It was an absurd position, one that would tire his core muscles within minutes and leave him exposed to any counterfire from below. But it gave him the angle he needed. Through a scope, the valley road appeared in sharp detail. It was a single-lane dirt path, now covered in snow and churned mud, winding to the trees and disappearing around a bend to the east. Soviet reconnaissance patrols had been probing the area for 2 days, testing the German defenses, mapping weak points. Matthias had watched them through binoculars from a lower position the day before. They moved in groups of 4 to 6 men, spread out in loose formation, rifles slung across their backs, confident in their numerical superiority. They didn't expect resistance from above. They didn't look up. The first patrol appeared just after 8 in the morning. 6 men, Soviet infantry in winter camouflage, moving west along the road in a staggered line. Matthias watched them through the scope, his breath slow and controlled, his heartbeat steady. He counted their steps, noted their spacing, identified the lead scout and the rear guard. Then he adjusted for wind, for the steep downward angle, for the way gravity would pull the bullet faster than it would on level ground. He aimed not at what man was, but where he would be in a half second it took the round to travel 300 meters down and forward. The rifle cracked. The lead scout collapsed. The other 5 froze, confused, scanning the tree line on either side of the road. They didn't look up. Matthias cycled the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered a new round. He fired again. The second man dropped. Now the patrol was panicking, scattering, diving for cover behind trees and rocks that offered no protection from a threat they couldn't see or locate. Matthias fired a third time, a fourth, a fifth. Within 90 seconds, all 6 men were down, sprawled across the snow in unnatural angles. And the valley was silent again. He did not feel pride. He did not feel guilt. He felt only the cold, the ache in his shoulders from holding position, and the certainty that more patrols would come. They did. At 10:30, another group of 5 Soviets appeared from the east, moving cautiously now, rifles raised, eyes sweeping the hillsides. Matthias waited until they reached the bodies from the first patrol, waited until they clustered together in confusion, trying to understand what had happened. Then he fired. 1 down. Bolt. Fire. 2 down. They scattered, but there was nowhere to go. The road was a kill zone, and Matthias was invisible, perched on a ridge they couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't comprehend. 3 down. 4 down. The 5th man ran, sprinting west in a desperate attempt to escape. Matthias led him by 2 meters and fired. The man fell mid-stride and didn't move. By noon, Matthias had killed 17 men. His arms were trembling from the strain of holding his body steady over the edge. His fingers were numb despite the gloves. His water was frozen solid in the canteen. But he didn't move. He ate a piece of venison without looking away from the scope, chewed slowly, swallowed, and kept watching. The Soviets changed tactics. The next patrol came with a different approach. Spread wide, moving through the trees on either side of the road rather than on the road itself, using cover, advancing in short bursts. It was smarter. It was still not enough. Matthias shifted his aim, tracked a figure moving between 2 pines, waited for the gap, fired. The man dropped. He tracked another, fired, dropped him. The patrol tried to retreat, but retreat meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Matthias killed 4 more before the survivors broke and ran east, abandoning their weapons, abandoning their dead. By mid-afternoon, the Soviets stopped sending patrols. The road was littered with bodies, 26 in total, and the silence that settled over the valley was heavier than the snow. Matthias knew they were regrouping, planning, calling for artillery or air support. He knew his position would be compromised eventually, but for now, the pass was held. Then, just before sunset, a new column appeared. Not a patrol, a full platoon, at least 40 men, moving west in disciplined formation with an officer at the front and a radio operator at the rear. They knew something was wrong. They had heard the reports. But they had orders, and orders meant forward movement regardless of cost. Matthias watched them through the scope. He counted 39 targets in range before the column would pass out of sight around the western bend. 39 men between him and mission success. 39 lives measured against the survival of his unit. The security of the pass, the outcome of a war he no longer believed in, but still served. He started with the officer. 1 shot, center mass, down. The column halted in confusion. Matthias fired again, targeting the radio operator. Down. Now, they had no leadership and no communication. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Men scattered, dropped prone, returned fire blindly toward the Tyrolean, toward the cliffs, toward everywhere except the impossible angle above them. Matthias worked methodically. 1 round, 1 target, 1 breath. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. The rifle became an extension of his will. The cold became irrelevant. The exhaustion became background noise. He cycled the bolt, acquired the next target, adjusted for movement, fired. Again, again, again. The Soviets tried to advance. Matthias killed the first 3 who moved. They tried to retreat. He killed the next 2. They tried to suppress him with machine gun fire, spraying rounds into the cliffs in a desperate attempt to hit something, anything. The bullet sparked off rock 30 meters to his left. They couldn't see him. They couldn't angle their weapons high enough. They were trapped in the open, exposed, dying. 13 more fell before the survivors broke formation entirely and fled east, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Matthias counted the bodies through a scope. 39. 39 men in less than 10 hours. 39 families who would receive letters. 39 futures erased by geometry and cold patience, and a man who knew mountains better than any tactician knew war. He stayed on the ridge until full dark, watching for any sign of another advance. None came. The Soviets had learned. The pass was impassable, not because of fortifications or artillery, but because of one man on a ridge that shouldn't have worked. When he finally climbed down, his legs barely held him. His hands were stiff claws around the rifle. His face was frostburned, his lips cracked and bleeding. His commanding officer met him at the base camp with hot coffee and a blanket, and a look that mixed respect with something close to fear. "How many?" the officer asked. 39, Matthias said. His voice was flat, empty, impossible. The angle was impossible, too. Matthias Auer never spoke about that day in detail, not to his unit, not to the historians who interviewed him decades later, not to his children. He survived the war, returned to the Tyrol, and worked as a carpenter until his death in 1989. He refused veterans' honors. He refused to be called a hero. When asked once why he had chosen such a dangerous, uncomfortable, tactically questionable position, he said only this: "Everyone else saw obstacles. I saw what the mountain allowed." The strategic impact of Matthias' stand was immediate and measurable. The Soviet advance through that pass stalled for 3 days, long enough for German supply columns to evacuate and for defensive lines to be reinforced further west. Dozens of vehicles, hundreds of tons of ammunition, and over 1,000 German soldiers escaped encirclement because one man refused to accept that an angle was impossible. But the deeper lesson of that frozen December day has nothing to do with tactics or kill counts. It's about the difference between seeing limitations and seeing potential. Every trained soldier who looked at that ridge saw why it couldn't work. Matthias saw how it could. The same rock face, the same wind, the same geometry, but completely different interpretation born from experience, intuition, and a willingness to trust what he knew over what he'd been taught. War is full of doctrine, of rules written by men who studied battlefields from safe distances and codified their conclusions into manuals. But war is also chaos, and chaos rewards those who can adapt, who can see past the limits of doctrine and use the terrain, the moment, the unexpected as tools rather than obstacles. Matthias didn't break the rules. He operated in a space where the rules didn't apply, where the impossible became irrelevant because he simply did it. There's a broader truth here, one that extends far beyond snipers and mountain passes. We are surrounded by people who will tell us what can't be done, what doesn't work, what's too risky or too unconventional or too far outside the lines. And often they're right. Most impossible things are impossible. Most bad angles are bad, but not all of them. And the ones that aren't, the ones that work precisely because no one expects them to, those are the moments that change outcomes. Matthias understood something fundamental about both mountains and men. Elevation changes everything. From ground level, the valley road was just a road. From 300 meters above, it was a shooting gallery. The Soviets never looked up because they never imagined a threat from that direction. The ridge was dismissed because it violated assumptions about stability and visibility and shooter comfort. But assumptions are only useful until someone proves them wrong. The 39 men who died that day were soldiers following orders, doing their jobs, advancing along a route that tactical maps said was viable. They weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were simply operating within a framework that didn't account for someone like Matthias, someone who had spent his entire childhood learning to read stone and wind and distance in ways no military academy could teach. They lost not because they were weak, but because they encountered something outside their model of how war worked. And Matthias won not because he was braver or crueler or more skilled with a rifle, though all those things were true. He won because he was willing to endure discomfort, to hold a position that hurt, to trust his body and his knowledge over the collective wisdom of everyone who said it wouldn't work. He wedged himself into a crack in the mountain and became part of it, immovable, patient, willing to suffer for as long as it took. That willingness to suffer for a purpose, to hold a line no one else will hold, to stay when retreat is easier, that's the heart of every story worth telling. It's not glamorous. It's not cinematic in the Hollywood sense. It's cold and exhausting and lonely, and it leaves scars that don't show on flesh. But it's the difference between those who survive history and those who shape it. Matthias Auer shaped history on a ridge no one remembers, in a valley that doesn't appear in most textbooks, during a retreat that was footnoted and forgotten. But the men who escaped because of him, the families who saw their fathers and sons come home, the supply lines that held, those ripple effects are real. One man, one rifle, one impossible angle, and a refusal to accept someone else's definition of what was possible. If you're watching this from somewhere in a world where mountains rise and battles are distant memories, understand this. The angle is only impossible if you believe it is. Matthias didn't believe it. He climbed the ridge, found the crack, wedged himself in, and did the work. The world called it impossible. The dead called it inevitable. That's the lesson. Not that violence solves problems. Not that war is noble, but that limits are often lies, that discomfort is a price worth paying for results, and that the person willing to hold the hardest position, the one everyone else abandons, is the one who controls the outcome. Matthias returned to his mountains after the war and never climbed that ridge again. He didn't need to. He had proven what needed proving. The stone remembered. The valley remembered. And 39 men who never looked up learned too late that elevation, patience, and an impossible angle are sometimes all it takes to rewrite the rules. The night before Matthias chose the ridge, the German unit had gathered in a makeshift command post, a half-collapsed hunting lodge buried in snow 2 kilometers east of the pass. The walls were scorched from a mortar strike weeks earlier, and the roof leaked freezing air through gaps in the timber. 16 men sat on ammunition crates and broken furniture, their breath visible in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. They were discussing options, all of them bad. The Soviet advance was 3 days out, maybe less. Intelligence reports, patchy and unreliable, suggested at least 2 battalions moving west with armor support. The German force tasked with holding the pass consisted of 1 understrength infantry platoon, no heavy weapons, no air support, and a dwindling supply of ammunition that wouldn't last a sustained engagement. The order from high command was clear. Delay the enemy as long as possible, then fall back. No one expected survival. They expected to buy time with their lives. Lieutenant Vogel, the commanding officer, was a gaunt man in his 40s who had been a schoolteacher before the war. He spread a hand-drawn map across a wooden table and pointed to the pass with a nicotine-stained finger. "We have 3 positions that offer any defensive value," he said. "The Tyrolean here, the stone bridge here, and the southern ridge here. None of them are ideal. All of them leave us exposed to flanking maneuvers." The men studied the map in silence. Most of them had been on the Eastern Front long enough to recognize a death sentence when they saw one. The Tyrolean offered concealment, but no cover from artillery. The bridge was a natural choke point, but would be targeted immediately by mortars. The southern ridge was too far from the road to provide effective fire support. Matthias stood in the back of the room, leaning against the cold stone wall, his rifle propped beside him. He didn't speak often in these briefings. He listened, absorbed, and made his own assessments. While Vogel pointed to conventional positions, Matthias was thinking about the northern ridge, the one no one ever mentioned because it didn't make tactical sense. He had scouted it 2 weeks earlier during a resupply run, and had spent an hour sitting on that outcrop, studying the valley, calculating angles, imagining scenarios. It was a terrible position by every standard military measure, but Matthias didn't think in standard measures. He thought in elevation, wind patterns, line of sight, and the psychology of an enemy who never looked up. When Vogel asked for volunteers to hold the southern ridge, 3 men raised their hands. When he asked who would take the Tyrolean, for more volunteered. When he asked about the bridge, silence. Everyone knew the bridge was a death trap. Matthias stepped forward. "I'll take the northern ridge," he said. Vogel looked at him, confused. "There is no northern ridge in the plan." "There's a ridge," Matthias said. "It overlooks the entire pass. 300 meters elevation. Clear line of sight." "I know the ridge you mean," Vogel said. "It's unusable. Too steep, no cover, no stable firing position. I can use it." Vogel studied him for a long moment. Every man in the room knew Matthias's reputation. He was a sniper who had held a farmhouse outside Minsk for 14 hours against a Soviet company, the marksman who had eliminated a commissar from 600 meters in a snowstorm, the hunter who moved through forests like a ghost and killed without hesitation. If Matthias said he could use the ridge, he probably could, but that didn't make a good idea. "You'll be alone up there," Vogel said. "No support, no resupply, no extraction if you're compromised." "I know. If they bring mortars or spotters, you'll be exposed. I'll be 300 meters above them, on a cliff face they can't climb. They won't see me." Vogel sighed and rubbed his face with both hands. "Fine, you take the ridge. But if it doesn't work, fall back immediately. Don't die for nothing." Matthias nodded. He didn't say what he was thinking, that all of them were going to die for nothing, that the war was lost, that these delaying actions were just bureaucratic gestures to satisfy officers hundreds of kilometers away who still believed in victory. He didn't say it because it didn't matter. He had a job to do, a position to hold, and a rifle that needed feeding. That night, Matthias didn't sleep. He sat outside the lodge, wrapped in his blanket, cleaning his rifle by the light of the moon. The Carabiner 98K was a bolt-action weapon, reliable, accurate, and simple. It had been issued to him in 1942, and he had maintained it with obsessive care ever since. Every screw was tight, every surface oiled, every component checked and rechecked. He had fired over 3,000 rounds through this rifle, and he knew its personality, its tendencies, the way it pulled slightly left in crosswinds, the way the trigger broke cleanest at exactly 2 kilograms of pressure. He thought about the men he would kill tomorrow. He didn't know their names or their faces or their families. He didn't know if they were Russians or Ukrainians or Georgians or conscripts from some distant province who spoke languages he'd never heard. He didn't know if they were believers in the Soviet cause or just men following orders like he was. It didn't matter. They would come down that road, and he would kill them, and the war would continue exactly as it had before. Matthias had stopped asking moral questions in the winter of 1943. After a week-long siege outside Kharkov, where he had watched men freeze to death in their foxholes, watched wounded soldiers beg for bullets to end their suffering, watched entire squads surrender only to be executed by both sides depending on who had ammunition to spare, where had taught him that morality was a luxury afforded to people far from fighting, people who could debate ethics over warm meals and safe rooms. Out here, morality was simple. Survive, complete the mission, protect the men beside you. Everything else was noise. He finished cleaning the rifle, loaded 6 stripper clips into his ammunition pouches, and lay down on the frozen ground to rest. He didn't sleep, but he closed his eyes and let his body recover what it could. At dawn, he would climb. The ascent to the ridge took 90 minutes. The slope was treacherous, a mix of loose scree, ice-slicked rock, and vertical sections that required climbing with both hands. Matthias moved slowly, testing each handhold, distributing his weight carefully, stopping every few meters to catch his breath and check his surroundings. The rifle was slung across his back, the ammunition pouches pressed against his ribs, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing. Halfway up, he paused on a narrow ledge and looked back at the valley. The command post was invisible beneath the canopy of snow-covered pines. The road was a thin gray line cutting through white emptiness. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with clouds that promised more snow by afternoon. It was beautiful in a way that indifferent things are beautiful, vast and cold, and utterly unconcerned with the small dramas of men killing each other below. Matthias reached the outcrop just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. He set down his gear, scanned the area for threats, and then lay flat on his stomach in position he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. His boots wedged into the crack in the stone. His torso hung partially over the edge. His elbows braced against the rock. His cheek pressed against the cold with the rifle stock. Through the scope, the valley road appeared in perfect clarity. Every detail sharp and immediate. He waited. Waiting was the hardest part of being a sniper. Harder than the shooting, harder than the cold, harder than the fear. Waiting required a kind of mental discipline that most men didn't possess. The ability to remain perfectly still and perfectly alert for hours at a time, to watch without distraction, to think without overthinking, to exist in a state of controlled readiness that burned energy even when the body didn't move. Matthias had learned to wait during his years as a hunting guide, sitting in alpine blinds from dawn to dusk, watching for the flicker of movement that meant a chamois was feeding on a ridge above or a stag was crossing the meadow below. He had learned that patience was a weapon, that stillness was a form of aggression, that the man who could wait longest usually won. The first patrol appeared at 8:17. Matthias had been on the ridge for 2 hours and 40 minutes. His shoulders ached. His fingers were numb despite the gloves. His bladder was full, but he ignored it. Through the scope, he watched 6 Soviet soldiers moving west in a loose staggered line, rifles slung, confident in their numbers and their momentum. They were talking to each other. He could see their mouths moving, probably complaining about the cold or joking about what they'd find when they reached the German positions. They didn't look up. Matthias centered the crosshairs on the lead scout's chest. The man was young, maybe 20, with a thin face and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. He was carrying his rifle casually, barrel pointed down, finger off the trigger. He had probably never been shot at from above. He had probably never considered the possibility. Matthias exhaled slowly, let his breath settle, felt his heartbeat slow to a calm rhythm. The wind was gusting from the southwest at approximately 15 kilometers per hour. The distance was 290 meters, almost straight down. Gravity would accelerate the bullet, but the angle would reduce the effective horizontal distance. He adjusted his aim 2 centimeters left, 1 centimeter low. Then he squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The recoil drove into his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the lead scout drop like a puppet with cut strings, collapsing onto the snow without a sound. The other 5 froze, confusion spreading across their faces in slow motion. Matthias cycled the bolt, the smooth mechanical action as familiar as breathing, the empty casing ejected, spinning through the air and disappearing over the edge of the ridge. He chambered a new round, acquired the second target, adjusted for the man's slight movement to the left, and fired. The second man dropped. Now the patrol was panicking, scattering toward the trees, shouting orders that Matthias couldn't hear but could read in their body language. One man dug behind a fallen log. Matthias put a round through his spine. Another tried to sprint across the road. Matthias led him by a meter and fired. The man's legs collapsed mid-stride. The 5th and 6th targets were firing blindly into the Tyrolean, muzzle flashes bright against the snow. Matthias killed them both within 10 seconds of each other. Then the valley was silent again. 6 bodies lay scattered across 50 meters of road, dark shapes against white snow, already beginning to be covered by the falling flakes that had started to drift down from the heavy clouds. Matthias cycled the bolt one more time, scanned the area for additional threats, found none, and allowed himself a single sip from his canteen. The water was ice cold and tasted like metal. He had killed 6 men in 90 seconds. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He felt nothing except the cold and the ache in his shoulders and the certainty that more would come. They came at 10:30. 5 men this time, moving more cautiously, rifles up, scanning the hillsides. They had found the bodies. They knew something was wrong, but they still didn't look up, still didn't imagine that death could come from such an impossible angle. Matthias waited until they clustered around corpses, waited until they were stationary and confused, and then he started firing. 1, bolt, 2, bolt, 3. The survivors scattered, but there was no effective cover. The road was a natural kill zone, exposed from above, flanked by terrain too open to hide in. Matthias tracked the 4th target through the scope, waited for a gap between trees, fired. The man dropped. The 5th was running west, sprinting in blind panic. Matthias led him, adjusted for wind, fired. The man fell and didn't move. 11 dead. The cold was getting worse. Matthias's fingers were starting to lose sensation. He flexed them inside the gloves, forced blood into the tips, and kept watching. The next patrol came at 1:15. 6 men, better trained, moving in proper tactical bounds, using cover, communicating with hand signals. Matthias killed the point man first, then the rear guard, then worked his way through the middle. They tried to suppress him with rifle fire, spraying rounds toward the cliffs in desperation, but they couldn't see him, couldn't angle their weapons high enough. couldn't comprehend a geometry that made him untouchable. Within 3 minutes, all 6 were down, 17 dead. Matthias ate a piece of venison without looking away from the scope. He chewed mechanically, swallowed, and kept watching. By mid-afternoon, 26 Soviet soldiers lay dead in the snow, and the patrols had stopped coming. Matthias knew what that meant. They were regrouping, calling for support, planning a different approach. He scanned the valley for any sign of movement, any indication of what would come next. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. Then, just before sunset, the column appeared. Not a patrol, a platoon, maybe more, moving west in disciplined formation with an officer at the front and a radio operator at the rear. Matthias counted quickly. 39 men in range before they would pass out of sight around the bend. He started with the officer.